Hello, my name is Michael Osterman. I'm the principal analyst with Osterman Research, and we're on a webinar today to discuss staying compliant in a work-from-home world. I'll be presenting today with Jeffrey Edwards. He's marketing manager at Progress. Jeff, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, happy to have you here. So a little bit about Osterman Research so you get a level set on where we're coming from in all of this. We're an independent market research and consulting firm very focused on the way that people communicate or collaborate in a workplace context. So we focus on things like compliance, of course, but as well as archiving, security, authentication, encryption, essentially any technology that allows people to work in an office setting or, as we're discussing today, in a work-from-home setting, essentially in a corporate environment. We have a very strong emphasis on primary research. We'll be going through a bit of that here today. The company is about 19 years old, and we're located in Western Washington. So, we're all familiar with the COVID-19 crisis, the sudden work-from-home environment that we're all in, and so forth. And most of you listening to this broadcast are probably going to be working in an environment, from your basement or your kitchen or your home office. What we found in a recent survey, and this survey was completed last week with more than 400 IT decision makers and influencers, is that about 55% of organizations today are in a jurisdiction that's subject to a stay-at-home or similar type of order. And even among many of those that are not, they're still being forced to work from home because they're considered maybe a non-essential business and so forth. So before the COVID-19 crisis, what we found is that about 18% of employees were working from home. In the matter of a few weeks, in the space of just a few weeks, that increased to about 80%. So we're seeing this massive shift of workers moving out of their office environment and having to start work from home. And that's created a number of different problems. We've seen a variety of things around compliance and security and archiving that we'll get into here in just a bit. But fundamentally, we're talking about a more than 400% increase in the number of employees working from home in the space of just a few weeks. That's incredibly disruptive and really unprecedented. Nothing like this has really ever happened before in world history. So in terms of concerns about key issues, there are lots of concerns out there. Lots of decision makers are worried about security, archiving, compliance, and all sorts of things. But what we found is that when we asked organizations, what do you think about these concerns on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is, we've got this covered, no concern at all, to 7 is we are extremely concerned. What we found, not surprisingly, is that almost half of IT decision makers and influencers are really concerned about hackers that are somehow going to try to take advantage of the current situation. They're going to increase the threats that they're sending out in the form of phishing, in the form of ransomware, malware, and so forth. And that's a real concern because now we've got a lot of employees that are sitting at home with an infrastructure that's not necessarily as good as the one they have at work. They don't have the firewalls in place. Their home routers are potentially leaky. So there are lots of potential problems here that organizations are going to be facing. There's also the risk of employees opening emails in error. Maybe they contain a ransomware link, maybe they contain phishing or some sort of an attachment. Lots of decision makers are concerned about that. They're also concerned, generally about the overall risk profile. About a third of organizations told us that they're, really very concerned about the overall risk that their organization faces as a result of employees working from home and the whole, problem we're having around COVID-19. Lots are concerned about risk of data loss. Lots are concerned about email and data backup and recovery just not being adequate for a remote workforce. And we'll get into some of the details here in just a bit. But fundamentally, there are lots of concerns that IT decision makers and influencers have that, they've always had. They've always been concerned about hackers and overall risk to the organization. But now they have a distributed workforce that they have never had before, at least in these numbers. And so these concerns are really amplified. Not surprisingly, most organizations were not prepared. I mean, most of us have heard that, there's going to be a pandemic coming one day. Bill Gates talked about it back in 2015. Lots of people have been forecasting this, but this hit all of a sudden and really took most people by surprise. What we found is that fewer than 1 in 5 organizations really was fundamentally very well prepared for this kind of work from home scenario. Another 32% consider themselves to be, fairly well prepared. So what we're finding is that roughly half of the organizations out there had very little preparation for this. They didn't have the at-home infrastructure that they needed. They didn't have the cloud services that they needed. They weren't doing monitoring and network performance as they needed and so forth. So we found really a lot of organizations that are now suddenly being forced to work from home for all of their employees really just didn't do enough to prepare for this. And again, it's not the kind of thing you would have expected in such a short period of time. So there's certainly to be excused for that lack of preparation in many cases. But this is a very disruptive event for the vast majority of organizations. Now, it's important to note that despite the fact that everybody's working from home now and that things are highly disruptive, lots of new web applications are being used and so forth, network monitoring continues to be a critical need. There's a lack of visibility into what's going on in the network, even in the best of cases, when everything is running normally, when you've got most of your employees, behind the firewall in your company and so forth. Network monitoring is still lacking in a lot of organizations, and a lack of visibility can lead to a variety of performance issues, can lead to security breaches, and data breaches have been a very common theme for most organizations and will continue to be, especially with the current COVID-19 crisis. And it can lead to a variety of other problems. A Forrester analysis, for example, found that about a quarter of critical IT issues take 44 hours to resolve because of a lack of network visibility. So this is a real issue in normal times, but now consider that employees are accessing your network resources, your data, your applications, virtual servers, and so forth from new or unknown systems. Then that creates an entirely different set of problems that organizations hadn't anticipated. Monitoring becomes much more difficult in the current environment. Proactive identification of problems, things like finding problem devices or identifying, the huge consumers of bandwidth in the organization is actually much more difficult. And you still have a lot of those same issues, despite the fact that maybe nobody is located in your office anymore. Bandwidth utilization is likely for most organizations very different than it was just a few weeks ago, because you have so many new sources of outside contact hitting your network, some of which may actually be bogus, and that's probably the case for most organizations. And finally, maintaining communication with remote sites is going to be key. But some of those sites may no longer be accessible. Maybe there's nobody working there, or maybe just one person now, just to keep things, to keep things running, semi-normally. So there are lots of problems. And Jeff, I wanted to ask you at this point, what are you seeing in terms of network monitoring for your clients that are now suddenly working from home?
So the biggest thing that we've observed so far is VPN connection monitoring has been a crucial thing for many businesses. When you have hundreds of employees now working from home and you have hundreds of people who need to access your on-premise network, be it for mail server or whatever they need to use your VPN to get into, you need to be able to maintain that VPN connection for each one of those people and ensure that you have enough licenses, that you have enough bandwidth, and that you have a good connection that's going to let these people access your network. That means keeping your firewall up to date, keeping your network, your on-premise network bandwidth well suited for the task at hand, all while you may not be on premise yourself. So the challenge is twofold. It's really keeping your remote workers happy and doing the work of keeping your network going remotely on your own.
Yeah, those are major challenges, and organizations are, I'm sure, going to be very hard pressed to meet those challenges.
Yes, absolutely. We've seen a lot of struggling, but also many of our clients are already well prepared with a network monitoring tool. So luckily they are able to, they were kind of able to test their networks in the weeks leading up to this and figure out, okay, we don't have enough capacity on our VPN. Okay, we don't have enough licenses. We need to beef this up. And most of them have had successful rollouts for the work from home environment that we're currently in.
That's great. Good to hear. So a few more things to consider. Certainly application monitoring is critical in any environment, but it's much more difficult when network admins really don't know what applications are in use. And we've seen, over the past few weeks, a huge increase in a variety of new applications in particular Zoom, that's gone from like 30 million users to 200 million users in the space of a month. We've seen lots of use of other sort of in-person replacement technologies like WebEx and so forth that are enabling people to still conduct business, still have meetings and so forth, but it imposes enormous demands on networks, on bandwidth, and so forth. And a lot of these applications that employees are using, they're doing so for the first time. And that creates its own set of problems that network admins and others have to deal with. Also, service level agreements. Do they really matter in an era when 4 out of 5 of your employees are working from home? Well, certainly they do, but they're going to be much more difficult to satisfy because now you've got lots of additional bandwidth usage, you've got lots of unknowns, many things to deal with that network admins and others really hadn't had to deal with before, at least to this great of an extent. And so, focusing also on endpoint management, it's a critical issue. For example, a 2018 LogMeIn survey found that 88% of respondents believe endpoint management is important, which it obviously is. But 30% of those IT professionals really don't know how many endpoints there are in the organization, and that's a problem that's really been amplified because of the COVID-19 crisis. You've got a lot of new endpoints hitting the network that never have done so before. Employees' laptops, home computers, mobile devices, and so forth that are all trying to access critical network resources. They're trying to access data stores and so forth. And these are pretty much unknown to the organization in many cases. And finally, endpoints, things like laptops, mobile devices, smartphones, and so forth, have access sensitive corporate data and assets. And part of the problem is that a lot of those applications that are trying to hit data resources are not really under the control of IT. One of the things we found really interesting in the survey is that the usage of Office 365, the corporate Office 365 license, has actually gone down over the past few weeks. And we think part of that is that most users are just employing their own copy of Office that they have for their own personal use, but they're using it now for work applications, and they just don't need to access the Office 365 license that the corporation has provided for them. So fundamentally, what we're talking about here too is the bring your own device or bring your own applications or cloud services or mobile apps really on steroids. The sudden work from home phenomenon is really the ultimate BYOD problem for network admins, IT admins, security analysts, people trying to manage networks, trying to manage security and so forth. This is really, pretty much a sudden shock for the vast majority of them. And so how does a company manage its network when almost all of the traffic is coming from remote employees? Again, that's not something that has really happened before, and we'll be turning to Jeff in a couple of moments here to get his take on this. So fundamentally, what we're talking about here is the work from home phenomenon that really caught most organizations off guard. They really weren't prepared for it in most cases, and they're having to scramble in terms of network bandwidth, in terms of application management, security, and so forth to really deal with all of this. And now certainly organizations can adapt to the new paradigm, and we are definitely seeing this happen, but it's going to take some time. There just aren't enough resources in many cases to address all of the issues, particularly around help desk calls that have really increased as a result of this. And so network performance monitoring and management really are going to remain critical challenges during this phenomenon and are going to become more important over time. So Jeff, I'd like to hand the floor over to you now.
Sure, thank you very much, Michael. So what I'm going to talk about today is the idea of proactive network monitoring for remote users and a remote network. So as I mentioned before, the problem for IT people and system administrators and network administrators today is really twofold. You are supporting hundreds of users, potentially thousands of users who were never remote before, and you're also supporting your network when you're not going to, you may be asked to go into the office occasionally, but you're not going to be in the office every day if you're on a work from home order or a stay-at-home order in your state. So what does that mean? That means you have to monitor all of your server event logs. You have to monitor for AV updates and activity, backup status, both on-site and remote, configuration status. You have to be able to reset to previous configurations if anything has changed and see if any configurations have changed. Very important, we mentioned you should be monitoring your firewall activity, bandwidth allocation, VPN connections, trying to look for failing VPN connections and diagnose the problems there, or possibly you have some users that are overusing their VPNs and straining your network. And then you want to do all the regular things you would have done anyway, such as monitoring for bottlenecks and throttling on your network, monitoring for application performance for anything that you have running on premise, such as Exchange servers or file transfer servers, or anything even that you have in the cloud. Office 365, you can monitor the health of, you can monitor your Azure instances, AWS instances, and even VoIP apps. You can just check simple up down, which can save a lot of heartache if you have people using VoIP every day, such as salespeople and multiple apps, and they need to know which ones are slow today and which ones are running well. And from all this, you can provide support for the remote issues that your users may be experiencing, and you can support your own network remotely yourself. So I'll go on to the next slide, please, Mike. Thank you. So first of all, the first question anyone's going to ask if everyone is working remotely and everyone is using a VPN to connect to your network is, do we have sufficient bandwidth? Is our ISP up to the task? So aside from making sure that you have the right amount of bandwidth on order, you want to collect, monitor, and analyze the network traffic on all the traffic on your network via VPN or local by the endpoint of the traffic, the port and interface and protocol that they're using, and the applications that are using traffic. This way, you can ensure the adequate bandwidth for all of the business critical applications that you might have, and meanwhile minimize the impact that non-critical applications or bandwidth usage has. With this, you can set a sort of a threshold, a baseline for your network with the typical network traffic analysis module, such as one that we have on WhatsUp Gold. You might be able to run a discovery of your network quickly, and that will run a SNMP discovery of your entire network and figure out what devices are using the most bandwidth, why, what the processes are, and then in a situation where everyone is working from home, and I'll talk about this in further depth shortly, you would be monitoring VPN connections. That is going to be the main source of bandwidth strain on your network, and your firewall is going to be people connecting in with VPNs. And you can monitor all sorts of information about VPNs. When someone's working from home, you're very much limited to what you can monitor on their devices, unless you have a polling agent installed on the device, which is unlikely if it's simply a salesperson or a marketing person on their home laptop. But you can monitor their VPN connection to your network, and that's going to allow you to identify best practices for VPN connections, such as, are they connected to your VPN when they need it? Or are they using it to connect to a cloud app, such as Office 365? Which doesn't necessarily need a VPN and has its own security protocols running. But we'll get into that in further detail a little bit later. So we can go on to the next slide now. And here we are at Firewall Health and VPN connections. So basically, at the base level, you want to be monitoring the VPN tunnels up-down status via SNMP polling and traps. And you just want to see if this tunnel is up or down, who's getting dropped VPNs, and then you'll be able to proactively reach out and know and start to solve that issue before you get tickets flowing in, because maybe one server went down or one licensing went down for your VPN, and now there's 5 or 10 people on a team that can't use their VPNs. You want to know about that beforehand before you get the tickets. So that's the very basic fundamentals of VPN monitoring. But beyond that, there's a lot more you can do with a full-fledged network monitoring tool, or you could set this up on your own via scripting or what have you. What you really want to be able to do is collect username, IP address, local address, the duration of the connection of the VPN, so you can sort the information that you gather and find, so this person has been connected to the VPN for 18 hours. Okay, they're probably not working from home for 18 hours straight. They probably don't need to be on the VPN for 18 hours. And if they're using, gigabytes of data, there's a chance that they forgot to turn their VPN off and they're streaming, Netflix or YouTube or something, and that's all going double duty back to your network and back to them. And no one wins in that situation. It's a bandwidth hog for them, for you. It's going to be slower for them. They're probably wondering what's going on, but this is something we've seen, and unfortunately, it's something we've seen frequently. It's not like the old days where you need to connect to the VPN to access everything. We have so many applications running the cloud. Personally, most of my workday, I don't have to connect to the VPN at all. So you can identify these issues of people who are over-connecting to the VPN, and then you have several ways from there that you can solve the problem. You could set up split tunnel VPN. If you don't want to have to educate every user on proper use of the VPN, you can simply have it only connect for certain IP addresses or certain on-premise applications, or you can simply educate the users and let them know, it's not appropriate to connect to the VPN for every little thing that you do on your computer. You're straining the network, etc. The next big thing you're going to want to keep an eye on, of course, is your firewall. So you're going to want to monitor the bandwidth usage of your firewall very carefully. You're going to want to watch the senders, receivers, and conversations happening to the firewall, the domains, the countries, applications and protocols, incoming, outgoing, interface traffic, interface utilization. You can monitor bandwidth usage by host and group. And then finally, you can set up your firewall monitoring with WhatsUp Gold, and particularly, you can set it up to watch for suspicious connections and even connections to Tor ports. So you can find out, if somebody's trying to connect via the firewall to really a sketchy site, a blacklisted site. That's possible. When your employees are working from home, you would think that they would be smarter than to do that, but there have been issues in the past. And with that, we'll take it to the next slide, Mike. Okay, so what's next? You want to monitor the business critical applications. In the basic sense, just like the VPN, you can monitor the up-down status of cloud and on-premise applications. You don't need anything fancy for that. Simple polling, SNMP will take care of that. But you can also, the best practice, is to create profiles and baseline performance metrics for all of your on-premise applications. So there's still going to be people accessing Exchange servers, SharePoint servers especially, are still a big use of VPN at our organization. And you're going to want to monitor the server performance as well as the application performance. And that way you can find trends and find spikes that you didn't expect in the application performance. You see here, this is our application monitoring dashboard here, and you have things like the status of the application over time. You have the running action policies on the application. You have a state summary, which will tell you everything that's been going on in the last polling state. And you have all the action policies that are running. And an action policy is something that you can set up so that when your application passes a certain threshold, say, if we're talking about a device, if it passed a certain threshold of GPU usage, you could have the application policies would then run an action. So it can either send an alert out, or it can even trigger a script that would do what we call a self-healing action, which is very useful if you're working remotely and you're managing the network. You can have something that maybe someone changed the configuration on, and you can have that set up so that when that is detected, it will automatically flip back and revert to the previous authorized configuration, which is really useful. So I'll take it to the next slide now, Mike. Thank you. Now, finally, we have monitoring cloud resources. And you might be asking yourself, if I'm using Azure, I have Azure Monitor. If I'm using AWS, I have CloudWatch. Why would you monitor cloud resources beyond what your CSP provides you with? They give you really good information. They give you really detailed information. And that's very true. CloudWatch I've used is an excellent tool. Azure Monitor is pretty good as well. But what they don't really give you is the connection between those resources and your network at large. They don't give you the interfaces. They don't give you dependencies, traffic. You're relying on their information for uptime, and you don't see it versus the rest of your network. And you're also unable to keep your data past 90 days without paying extra in a lot of cases. When you monitor your cloud resources through WhatsUp Gold, or many of our competitors do the same thing, you're able to monitor that information and keep that information as long as you want. And you can also set up reports on things like trends in cost and usage. You can track your cloud budget versus use. So if you have a few instances of Azure set up and you're not using them, you don't have them sitting there in perpetuity forever, just using up money and not being used for what they're meant for. So you can have a threshold that says, if this is not being used past this threshold, let's put an action policy in place that is going to deprovision these resources and we're not going to be paying for them anymore. Or you can do the same thing if you have excessive spend rate, if they're being used too much, if there's something happening that is sending these instances crazy, you can be alerted for that and just cut them off completely or investigate further. So that's sort of the basis of why you would want to monitor cloud resources through a dedicated monitoring tool. And in a situation like we're in right now, it's doubly important, especially with cloud applications. You definitely want to have the up-down status of your Azure instances, your AWS instances, your Office 365 licensing. You can monitor for that, check how that's going, and make sure that nobody's going to be shut out of anything critical while they're in the middle of their workday at home. And I'll take it to the next slide now. So you may be asking yourself, how does all this help with compliance? So network monitoring, not a compliance tool per se, but there's one use case that is absolutely critical. And that is, I mentioned earlier, configuration and change management. So what that means is you're going to be monitoring the configuration of all the devices on your network, and you're going to monitor for changes in that configuration. And you're going to be able to take actions when you detect those changes. So routers, switches, firewalls, anything that can be configured, we can monitor the configuration of. Anything with an IP address, we can monitor. So what you're going to want to do is set up a baseline configuration for each type of device. And with WhatsUp Gold in particular, there are hundreds of out-of-the-box configurations that will automatically be applied when you scan your network and find a certain server. And you can set those up for also out-of-the-box certain compliance environments. So if you have HIPAA, PCI DSS, anything like that, SOX, all of that is built in, GDPR. So those configuration policies are now the baseline and automatically set across the network. Now, to prove that compliance, you can schedule regular audits and reports via the polling and search functions of the monitoring that will give you a list of your devices, the configurations, and tell you, this is what is in compliance, this is what's not in compliance, and you'll be able to find that much faster than if you had to look in person or just go and investigate every single configuration on your own. If someone changes a configuration, we have two types of configuration changes and monitoring. We have approved and unapproved. So you can set a user as approved, and it will let you know that there's been an improved configuration change. It's not going to just ignore it when they make configuration changes. You're still going to be alerted for that if you choose to be. And then you have unapproved. And for an unapproved configuration, you're going to get an alert, but you can also do an action policy, which is going to be able to initiate backups to prior configurations. So if there's a configuration change that happens and puts something out of compliance, you're going to be able to very easily have that automatically set back into the compliant state without you ever having to lift a finger, which is extremely important in a time like now when we have, you might not be able to get to a server and change configurations from your home via your VPN. If it's self-healing, that's all the better. Finally, troubleshooting network device configuration errors is obviously a lot easier when you have this access to the earlier versions of configuration files, which means lower mean time to repair. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about proactive monitoring. It's all about getting things done before users even know that it's affected them negatively. And I think this is the last slide. Is there another one, Mike?
No, that was it, Jeff.
All right. So that's all I have for you. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much. And thank you for the great information. And I'm sure people will be able to put this to use in short order. Here is our contact information. If you have any questions on the survey that I mentioned, or if you want to get to Jeff, we can certainly relay any messages to him. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody who was here on the call with us today. And that's the end of this webinar. Have a great day.
Thank you.